Good morning, everyone, and welcome to 2022 B-CoP online study visit. I'm Jamie Park, a program officer of the PEMNA Secretariat, and I'll be moderating today's meeting. This online study visit was proposed by Indonesia MOEF on the topic of benchmarking budget and policy for countermeasuring the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, Korea Ministry of Economy and Finance will be presenting on Korea's fiscal response to COVID-19 and its preparation for the post-COVID era. Following the presentation, we will have a Q&A session to further discuss the list of questions prepared by the Indonesia MOEF. And now let's begin this meeting with the opening remark led by Mr. Ki-nam Oh, Division Director of Fiscal Management and Coordination of Korea MOEF, to be followed by Mr. Rufianto Kurniawan, Director of State Budget Planning from Directorate General of Budget Indonesia MOEF. So please welcome Mr. Ki-nam Oh.
Hello. It's great to see you all. I'm really happy to be joining this meeting today. I'm Ki-nam Oh, Director of Fiscal Management in the Ministry of Finance. I'm in charge of the PEMNA and its communication in Korea. I know that it took a while to arrange this. As you might know, there have been a lot of things going on in the Korean government. The presidential election was held in March. The new government was launched in May. A supplementary budget prepared by the government approved by the National Assembly a couple of weeks ago, and so on. As for the supplementary budget, it is directly linked to today's main topic. It was mainly designed to provide financial support to small business owners who had suffered the most during the pandemic. Today's meeting aims to discuss the Korean government's fiscal response to the pandemic and the lessons learned in the meantime. This is one of the biggest ongoing issues in Korea as well, so we can share our up-to-date experience and knowledge. However, some of the topics, like the evaluation of the fiscal programs, are not easy to cover today. Since the program started just 1 or 2 years ago, and the pandemic is still going on, I hope you understand this. I think we can discuss the performance of the programs a couple of years after the pandemic is over. Before beginning the meeting, let me introduce the participants from our side. On my right, Deputy Director Soohyun Park is joining the meeting. She is taking care of all the technical issues regarding PEMNA in the government. If you have any need to discuss any PEMNA issue directly to the Korean government, she is the one you are most likely to talk to first. And Ms. Jiyeon Kim, our translator, wave your hand, is joining us too. And on my left, Director Soohyun Yoon from the Budget Office is attending to give you a brief picture of what the Korean government has done to overcome COVID-19 in terms of budgetary measures. I'm going to wrap up here and turn over to Ms. Soohyun Park.
Thank you, Mr. Ki-nam Oh. And now I'll invite Mr. Rufianto Kurniawan. Mr. Rufianto, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I forget to unmute. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished representative from PEMNA Secretariat, PEMNA B Facilitator, and also our colleagues from Ministry of Economy and Finance of Korea, and our colleagues from Ministry of Finance Indonesia. Good morning to all of you. I wish all of you have excellent health and good condition. Thank you for having us here today, to having me to represent Indonesia B-CoP to give this opening remark at this PEMNA B-CoP online study. Let me first thank you for PEMNA that give Indonesia opportunity to receive this study visit program. My sincere gratitude goes to Korea government for accepting us to be the host country. Thank you to the Ministry of Economy and Finance of Korea for fulfilling our request and give the time to receive us, in which we would like to discuss regarding benchmarking on budget and policy for countermeasuring COVID-19 pandemic. I also would like to thank you to PEMNA Secretariat and B-CoP Facilitator for making this activity happen, and everyone for attending this forum. So I believe that most of us actually we want to have face-to-face study visit, physically visit. But we are grateful that this study visit still could be carried out, even though we still use online platform. We still need to wait and see regarding the development of this COVID-19 pandemic situation. And therefore, so I think that our discussion for today, the topic for today is still very relevant. So distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it has been more than 2 years since the COVID-19 pandemic occurred. Throughout the 2020, we fought for help against the virus and its effect by implementing strict health protocol and also doing activity restriction. Meanwhile, at the same time, we fought also to recover from the economic condition. We realize economic is down, so bringing back to the positive economic growth is very important. And this year, last year, 2021 is a transitional period for the handling the COVID pandemic, and also it is crucial time for the economic recovery. So the 2021 budget has a very strategic role as the key instrument to facilitate and handling this COVID, as well as it is very important to speed up economic recovery. And now we entering the 2022. Even the number of COVID sufferers has decreased significantly, and the effect of the pandemic are going down, it is still require us to remain focused and taking strategic step to ensure relevant policy. There must be lesson learned from the pandemic, and many reforms have been done, including in Indonesia and also I think in Korea. The government also took strategic steps like providing significant stimulus, and also managing package policy, calculating, doing budget revision, and many more to handle this COVID. The step taken and also the output may produce different, because the condition in every country, in Indonesia, in Korea, are different. So maybe the policy are different, but actually the objective is the same. We want to handle the COVID and to recover our economy. So through this forum, we will learn and discuss. We will learn from Korea about budget and policy for countermeasuring COVID-19 pandemic. This is also important forum for us to take lesson from the activity by the Korean government to give us more perspective in facing related COVID pandemic. This will also give us insight in formulating action for the future step in order to recover the economy. So finally, I also like to thank to all of the participants for this meeting. Thanks again for everyone for joining this forum, and especially to the Korean government to bring the host country, and also to the PEMNA Secretariat. I'm grateful for this opportunity, and we hope that this study visit will be benefited to all of us. Thank you to everyone.
And without further ado, I will turn the floor over to our speaker. Our presenter today is Soohyun Yoon, Division Director of Budget Management from the Korea MOEF. And again, he'll be presenting on Korea's fiscal response to COVID-19. And let us all welcome Soohyun Yoon.
Hello, good morning. This is Soohyun Yoon, Director of Budget Management Division at the Ministry of Economy and Finance. Today, I'd like to give a presentation on South Korea's policy measures to overcome the COVID-19 crisis and prepare for the post-COVID era. Next slide. I've divided my presentation into 5 parts. Next slide. I've divided my presentation into 5 parts. 1, the background of Korea's response to the pandemic. 2, our disease prevention and control measures. 3, supplementary budget for fiscal year 2020. 4, lessons we learned and the conclusion. Next. And next. The first COVID case was confirmed in January 2020. Since then, Korea saw 3,736 infections and 18 deaths in a month. Meanwhile, during the 2015 MERS outbreak, 186 people were infected and 38 people died in 1.5 months. A comparison of the figures suggests that COVID-19 shows a higher infection rate and a lower fatality rate among patients. The disease began to spread across the nation, leading to an economic downturn. The customer survey index fell from 104.2 in January 2020 to 96.9 in February 2020, recording the biggest drop since the 2015 MERS outbreak. Over the same period, the business survey index went down from 76 to 65, also posting the biggest drop since the European financial crisis in 2012. This sparked widespread concerns that the economy will fall into a recession. COVID-19 sent an unprecedented shockwave to the Korean economy. Hence, the Korean government immediately responded to the pandemic with an aim for a swift and strong economic recovery. At the same time, to prepare for the post-COVID era, the government drew up a series of supplementary budgets by fully demonstrate its policy capabilities. 4 rounds of supplementary budget from March to September 2020 and a customized relief package in December 2020 were prepared. More specifically, the government set up the first budget of 11.7 trillion won the second budget of 12.2 trillion won, the third budget of 35.1 trillion won, the fourth budget of 7.8 trillion won, and the customized relief package of 9.3 trillion won. In 2021, two supplementary budgets, each worth 14.9 trillion won and 34.9 trillion won were prepared. And this year, up to May, the government drew up two sets of supplementary budgets, each worth 16.9 trillion won and 62 trillion won. While the 2020 and 2021 budgets aimed at overcoming the imminent COVID-19 crisis, the 2022 budgets aimed at compensating small business for their losses incurred due to the pandemic. Now, I'd like to elaborate on how Korea responded to the pandemic. Our response consists of 4 strategies. First, stabilizing the supply of masks. Second, executing the 40 plus alpha strategy. Third, effectively curbing the spread of the virus by utilizing ICT. And fourth, securing enough vaccines. First, on increase in mask supply. In the early stage of the outbreak, demand for masks soared, leading to a serious shortage of masks in the market. As a result, the price of masks skyrocketed, which put a huge pressure to households. Accordingly, the government is regulations on mask production facilities and implemented a 5-day rotation mask distribution system until June 2020 to increase the supply of masks and stabilize the market. These measures ensure that every individual had access to enough masks. Second, 40 plus alpha strategy. With the mindset that disease prevention efforts act as a vaccine, the government pushed ahead with the strategies of test, treat, trace, transparent communication, and mask mandates, thereby elevating our pandemic preparedness. National briefings were held twice a day, which helped the government gain considerable public trust through communication. Third, information and communication technology was utilized to respond to COVID. For example, the government introduced the self-quarantine safety protection app and drive-through testing centers to effectively curb the spread of the virus. Fourth, efforts were made to secure enough vaccines. The government procured a total of 56 million doses in 2020 and 2021. Additionally, 5.8 trillion won was earmarked for vaccine purchases, disease prevention, and control efforts in 2022. Thanks to the cooperation between the government and the private sector in vaccination campaigns, Korea was able to reach a high vaccination rate in a short period of time. As of October 2021, more than 70% of the total population were fully vaccinated. Let me now discuss Korea's economic and fiscal policy to respond to the pandemic, the supplementary budget for fiscal year 2020. Before I move on, I'd like to talk about the proactive measures that the government took to overcome the COVID crisis early on. Ever since the first confirmed case was found in Korea in January 2020, the government has been all out in implementing prevention and control measures. Emergency support measures worth 4 trillion won were drawn up by industries and sectors in February 2020 to help the pandemic hit business bounce back. The measures focused on preparing a disease prevention and control system, to respond to COVID, supporting hospitalization and treatment of patients in quarantine, stabilizing the supply of hygiene products, including masks, and providing financial and tax support to struggling business. As the pandemic did not show sign of abating at the end of February 2020, the government announced a support package worth about 16 trillion won to provide robust support for damage recovery and prop up the economy. The focus was on carrying out disease prevention measures more thoroughly, providing support to the pandemic hit groups, and boosting consumption and investment. However, despite such aggressive response, COVID rapidly spread among local communities, severely impacting people's livelihoods and increasing the downside economic risk. Hence, to swiftly recover damages and minimize the negative impact COVID has on the economy, the government prepared a series of supplementary budgets. In March 2020, the National Assembly passed the first supplementary budget worth 11.7 trillion won. First, 2.3 trillion won was allocated to strengthen the disease prevention system in terms of quarantine, diagnosis, and treatment of infectious disease, to offer compensation for loss to healthcare facilities that were hit hard by quarantine measures, and to provide living expenses to hospitalized patients and those in quarantine. Second, 2.4 trillion won was arranged to recover damages that SMEs and small business owners experienced due to COVID. The government aimed to expand low interest rate loans, support business to retain jobs, bring down the rent, help traditional markets, and issue more vouchers. Third, 3 trillion won was allocated to provide financial support to households and achieve stable employment with the goal of overcoming the pandemic early on. The amount was used to issue vouchers for low-income families and expand wage subsidies to allow a stable working condition for the youth. Fourth, 0.8 trillion won was earmarked to support the recovery of sagging local economies. The government supported special employment stabilization measures by pandemic-affected areas and expanded the issuance of local gift certificates, thereby promoting revitalization of local economies. The second supplementary budget was approved in April 2020, at a time when COVID spread across the world, heavily restricting global mobility and causing supply and demand side shocks. This raised the concern that global economy may face the worst recession since the Great Depressions in 1930s. Domestically, the real economy began contracting as production, investment, and consumption all dwindled. Against this backdrop, the government announced the emergency relief payment, which provided up to 1 billion won per 4-person household. In July 2020, the third supplementary budget amounting to 35.1 trillion won was announced. First, the government included a revenue adjustment of 11.4 trillion won in the budget, which was generated by tax breaks and lowered economic growth estimates due to COVID. Second, 5 trillion won was allocated for the financial support package that included emergency financial support and emergency cash flow support for businesses. Third, 9.4 trillion won was earmarked to strengthen employment and social safety nets. The goals were to create more than 550,000 jobs in the public sector, in particular in contactless and digital industries, provide special employment subsidies, and expand the emergency welfare support for low-income households. Fourth, 11.3 trillion won was arranged for investment in the Korean New Deal to ensure new growth engine. The budget was spent to offer incentives to reshoring companies that bring overseas manufacturing operations back home, and to reinforce the DNA, data, network, AI ecosystem by building, opening, and allowing use of data in areas that are closely related to people's lives, and by nurturing 100,000 key talents in the fields of AI and software. In the early days of the pandemic, the Korean economy showed signs of recovery, leading to expectation of an economic rebound in the third quarter of 2020. However, we saw a new surge in cases, and the economy slowed down further. In particular, small business owners, individuals with job insecurity, low-income households, and families with children were in desperate need of support, since they were the hardest hit groups in the society. Therefore, fourth supplementary budget worth 7.8 trillion won was set up in September 2020. First, an emergency support package amounting to 3.9 trillion won was prepared for small businesses owners and the self-employed who saw a decline in revenues. Business stability subsidies and business operating loans were additionally provided to SMEs and small merchants affected by social distance. Second, the government arranged an emergency employment package of 1.5 trillion won for workers exposed to high risk of job loss. Emergency employment subsidies were provided to dependent, self-employed workers and freelancers. 2.4 million jobs were created to aid disaster recovery efforts. Third, the government prepared an emergency livelihood package amounting to 0.4 trillion won for households suffering from income loss. Efforts were made to provide an emergency livelihood funding, create jobs for low-income individuals, and help them get employed. Lastly, an emergency child care package worth 1.8 trillion won was set up for parents struggling with child care due to school closures. As part of the support, the government granted extra child care subsidies 200,000 won per preschooler and elementary school student, and online education subsidies of 150,000 won per teenager aged 13 to 15. In December 2020, COVID cases resurged, which forced the government to raise the level of social distancing. The economy, which showed improvements, turned sluggish again, and revenues of small businesses dropped. This situation raised concerns that more severe damage may occur. In response, the government immediately came up with a customized relief package, such that proactive responses can be taken to prevent further damage to people's livelihood. The customized relief package of 9.3 trillion won focused on providing emergency relief for small business owners and individuals with job insecurity, enhancing disease prevention measures to reinforce the public health infrastructure, and providing customized support for small business owners, SMEs, and employed and the unemployed, low-income households, and families with children. First, the government allocated 5.1 trillion won to cover rents for pandemic-hit small merchants, 0.5 trillion won to offer income support for employees with job insecurity, 0.4 trillion won to swiftly reinforce the public health infrastructure, and 0.4 trillion won to compensate losses to healthcare facilities that offered hospital beds for COVID patients. In addition, the government earmarked 0.5 trillion won to help small business owners and SMEs recover their sales and revenues to pre-pandemic levels. 0.5 trillion won infused liquidity. 0.5 trillion won to help the employed find jobs and create jobs for the elderly. 0.2 trillion won to improve livelihoods and working conditions of dependent self-employed workers. 0.1 trillion won to draw up emergency welfare support needed to strengthen the social safety net for vulnerable groups. And 0.2 trillion won to ease the burden of childcare. Those were Korea's policy measures in the early stage of the pandemic. Next, I'd like to turn to the Korean New Deal, an initiative developed to prepare for the post-COVID era. The government launched the Korean New Deal in July 2020 to overcome the COVID crisis and to transform Korea into a global leader in the area of a great economic and social transition triggered by the fourth industrial revolution. By making aggressive investments and institutional improvements through the year since the launch, Korea successfully led a transition into a digital and eco-friendly society. For instance, we promoted contactless transactions and education and built a low-carbon, eco-friendly ecosystem. In the meantime, international politics and economic landscape underwent a rapid change, which required us to take a new approach. Accordingly, the Korean government pushed ahead with the Korean New Deal 2.0 with a budget of 33.7 trillion won in total, based on the achievements of the past 1 year. Investments were made through the 3 pillars of the Korean New Deal 2.0, Digital New Deal, Green New Deal, and Human New Deal. Under the Digital New Deal, 9.3 trillion won was invested to establish an open metaverse platform, promote services based on ICT convergence, and develop key digital technologies such as cloud and blockchain, with an aim of enhancing our competitiveness in the digital industry. 13.3 trillion won was arranged for the Green New Deal. The budget was used in promoting renewable energy and green mobility, including hydrogen cars, and in aiding the development of carbon reduction technologies by industries. Such projects were financed by the newly launched Climate Response Fund. For the Human New Deal, 11.1 trillion won was allocated to dramatically invest in people. The government carried out youth-friendly policies to ease burdens related to asset, housing, and education, and to bolster support for employment of young people as they are a key human resource. In addition, policies to strengthen inclusiveness were implemented to narrow the income gap and address inequalities that worsened since the COVID outbreak. Then what lessons have we learned from our experience? First, prompt decision-making from leadership and transparent, clear communication with the public are significant. The Korean government promptly initiated infectious disease response governance at the start of the pandemic. It later launched the Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasure Headquarters under the leadership of the Prime Minister. Second, when responding to an economic shock caused by a pandemic, it is critical to compose a cohesive, comprehensive, and phased economic response package. Third, even the best policies will not be effective without adequate and timely funding. Enough funding provided to vulnerable groups in a timely manner plays a crucial role in overcoming the economic crisis caused by COVID-19. Fourth, countries must prepare for social and economic changes while responding to an economic and health crisis. When the society changes rapidly due to COVID-19, the fourth industrial revolution or the like, vulnerable groups should be taken into consideration to achieve economic stability more smoothly after such change. Fifth, in the event of a prolonged pandemic, it is critical to find the right balance between disease control and economic stability. Throughout the COVID crisis, Korea has been striving for a stable management of the pandemic without completely shutting down the economy. Other governments should also seek measures to promote a balance between disease control and economic stability suitable for their own countries. Korea implemented aggressive fiscal policies, including 4 rounds of supplementary budgets and focused policy capabilities on achieving swift and robust economic recovery and becoming a leading global economy in the post-COVID era. In turn, Korean economy recovered swiftly and strongly compared to other major economies. Korea has the first developed country to recover to pre-pandemic GDP levels in the first quarter of 2021. In the second quarter of 2021, Korea recorded the highest economic recovery among major economies. Korea expanded customized support for small business owners and individuals with job insecurity and further tightened employment and social safety nets. As a result, even when the pandemic mostly affected vulnerable groups, household income continuously increased. Also, the redistributive effect of government policies expanded significantly. Household income quintiles improved for 2 consecutive quarters. Korea's response to COVID-19 can offer useful insights to help other countries recover from the current crisis and prepare for another emergence of an infectious disease. In closing, we are living in an ever more connected world, and infectious disease no borders. Therefore, the world cannot defeat COVID without international cooperation. That is why all countries, including Korea, must come together to share their best practice to overcome this unprecedented global health crisis. That concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Yoon, for a informative presentation, and I'm sure our audiences learned a lot from this. At this juncture, we will go ahead and take some questions from the participants, and as just a reminder, you can also write on the chat box. While we are having more questions from the participant, we can also address the list of questions that was prepared by Indonesia MOEF. So, Ms. Soohyun, could you also talk about the list of questions that we had on our agenda?
질문 중에 여러 가지
Of the questions, I think that many of these already have been covered in the course of the presentation. So I would like to discuss those questions that have not been touched upon during the presentation. With that, I believe that the first question on policies and budget, about the fiscal policies and strategies that Korea has applied, I believe that we have already covered that. I think that the second question on the legal basis, I can respond to this particular question.
Q&A session, we can talk about the program implementation and evaluation. Could we first talk about the first question on the agenda?
아니요. Policy and budget at number 2.
Well, actually, let's start with policy and budget number 2.
Okay. So for the session, we'll talk about what are the legal basis of policy formulation for handling COVID-19 pandemic in Korea.
예, 한국의 국가재정법에 기반한
Based on the National Finance Act and as a measure of ordinary fiscal policy, supplementary budget bills were prepared and approved by the National Assembly in order for us to respond to the pandemic. And to compensate for losses due to business shutdown and curfew, separate legal basis was required in order for us to provide such compensation, and thereby in July 2021, the Act on the Protection of and Support for Micro Enterprises was amended.
그다음에 3번도 이미 프레젠테이션에서 이미 설명이 됐던 것
I
같고요.
think that the third question has already been covered in the presentation, so we can move on to question 4.
So the first question is, how does Korea set budget priority during the COVID-19 pandemic?
예, 답변 드리겠습니다. 코로나 관련
Yes, to answer that question, all COVID-related fiscal policies were our top priority, but in terms of the size of the budget, subsidies for small business owners and vaccine and disease control budgets were the largest.
다음에 5번도 이미 프레젠테이션에서 설명이 됐던 것 같고요.
I
6번에
think we've already covered question 5, and so we'll move on to question 6.
And now we'll move on to the sixth question, what is the strategy to maintain physical sustainability in Korea after the COVID-19 pandemic?
예. 중장기 재정 여력을
To secure mid to long-term fiscal capacity, fiscal sustainability needs to be maintained. And this was reflected into the 2023 budgeting guideline,
그 내용은 크게 세 가지 정도로 볼 수 있습니다.
which consists of three main parts. First,
코로나 위기 대응을 위해 확대되었던
temporary fiscal spending that was bolstered in order to counter COVID-19 will be normalized so that discretionary spending will be gradually rolled back to pre-COVID levels. Secondly, we will find new fiscal resources and discuss adopting Korean fiscal rules.
세 번째,
And thirdly,
내적 2월 불용 등 집행 부진 사업은
poorly executed projects that were unused and carried forward will be evaluated on performance and actual level of execution for downsizing. Government committees that were temporarily or committees that were temporary or sunset in nature will in principle come to termination as part of spending restructuring.
And now we'll move on to the program implementation and evaluation part. Could you please answer these questions that's on the screen right now?
I'm going to answer the number one question. As I mentioned before at the beginning of this meeting, most programs started just 1 or 2 years ago and are still on implementation stage, so it is not easy to evaluate the effectiveness. However, some of the programs such as mask supply, stabilization, and vaccination campaigns could be said effective. At the beginning of the pandemic, Korea suffered from shortage of mask supply. The government engaged in and successfully managed the situation. It took 4 months to solve the supply issues. And also the vaccination program was also successfully executed. The rate of the vaccinated in Korea is more than 85%. The experts say it is one of the factors that Korea can maintain the fatality rate so low. And I'm going to answer the next question. We can give almost the same answers to the number 2 and number 3 questions. I'm going to answer the 2 questions altogether. We have fully utilized the already established system and governance to monitor implementation of the fiscal programs to fight against the COVID-19. First, the interministerial fiscal management meeting was held every month to discuss progress and status of fiscal program to fight against COVID-19. If there is any problem or bottleneck in implementation identified, the Ministry of Finance and other relevant ministries pulled together to solve the issue. And also, customized execution management was implemented by setting priorities according to the nature of the business. Swift disbursement was the key to the direct cash payment program's success. And a long-term program like employment support program was aimed to balance the execution throughout the year. For example, in 2020, the supplementary budget for disaster relief fund was approved by National Assembly, which was eligible for almost every citizen in Korea. For swift execution, a government-wide task force team and intergovernmental task force team was established and paid out all the budget in only 2 months. And I'm going to answer the question number 4. We fully utilize the already established budget system. The A public participatory budgeting process was introduced in 2018. This year, around more than 100 million US dollars of budget were formulated through the participatory budgeting. Last year, a lot of online corona-related topics were discussed in the website for the participatory budgeting, such as inequality of education caused by the COVID-19 and shortage of medical supply, etc. These discussions led to fiscal programs to increase the number of negative pressure ambulances, which was included in the 2022 budget. Also, various levels of government officials have been making a lot of on-site visits during the pandemic and listen to the voice from the public, including small business owners. 그리고 나머지 lessons learned and going forward는 대부분 PowerPoint에서
As for lessons learned and going forward, I think most of that have been covered by our PowerPoint presentations.
Thank you for answering the questions. Do you have any other questions from Indonesia MOEF?
저희가 파워포인트는 공유를 해드릴 수 있고요. 인도네시아 측에.
We can share with you the PowerPoint slides as well as our presentation scripts to the Indonesian partners.
We'll wait a couple more for questions from the Indonesia MOEF. I see a hand from Mr. Arwan.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. I have a few questions regarding the presentations, if you don't mind. The first is, how do you support financing the Korean local government with less fiscal capacity during the pandemic? I mean, here especially to fund local government public expenditure or timeline infrastructure project. The second is, I saw from your slides, if I'm not mistaken, in respect to tax reductions upon the COVID-19 outbreak, what sector that the Korean government incentivized most? And if you don't mind sharing the considerations or assessment of why this sector needs to be incentivized. And the last one is, to date, how are the Korean government's policy and fiscal directions in preparing for a pandemic to endemic so far? I think that's questions that I want to ask. I give it back to you. Thank you.
먼저 지방 정부 관련
Starting with the local government,
지방 정부는 이제 재정 여력이 크지는 않아서
because the local governments do not have fully sufficient budget capacity. So not all local governments are part of this project, but they mostly focused on issuing local gift certificates, and this was also funded together with the central government. And this gift certificate was issued in order to revitalize the local commercial sector and to help bolster the small business owners in the local areas, and it was most effective. And another thing that the local government did was to, when paying out the subsidies for the public, each local government sometimes provided additional subsidies of their own. Not all local governments, but some of the local governments with fiscal capacity to do so, paid out extra subsidies. And for tax breaks, overall, the tax payment deadline was extended in general. And for pandemic hit businesses, they received tax breaks. One of the key features was reduced rent. And the biggest challenge for small business owners was paying their rent. So the landlord, when a landlord reduces the rent for a particular month, they were provided with tax breaks from the central government in order to incentivize lower rent. And also, to add to the local government question, because local governments do not have the fiscal surplus or capacity, central government took on much of that burden. And if possible, we provided pandemic-related budgetary support, or when we prepared the supplementary budget, the central government actually took most of the responsibility to provide support to the local governments in executing the projects. And for local governments, there's a disaster fund that local governments had, and I think that disaster fund played a huge role during the pandemic. And as for the evaluation or the future direction regarding fiscal strategy, in terms of overcoming the pandemic in Korea, we believe that our fiscal policies have contributed. However, during the pandemic, the fiscal spending was boosted by a large degree, and that degree of increase will have to be rolling back and reduced for fiscal sustainability.
And I see a hand from Lufit too.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for excellent presentation and very comprehensive. So actually, it is important. There are efforts to tackle the pandemic. There are two important activities. Of course, the first is how to support the health sector. It is very important for us to provide vaccination, vaccine to the whole people. And I think the result in Korea has been very good, 85% of the population. It is also important to provide medicine and equipment, And in Indonesia, the most expensive is how we should pay the claim for patient. That's very expensive. We need huge budget for that. And I think the second activity is to maintain the economy, to provide social assistance to the poor people and also to the small businesses, small merchants. In Indonesia, we have the data for the poor people. We have the list, the poorest people, 10% of the population up to the 20% of the population who are the poorest that need the support, and also for the formal sector, formal employment to certain level of salary. They will get the support from the government. However, as we see in the presentation, in Korea, there were also support for small businesses, small merchant. So, and in the case of Indonesia, there are so many small merchant, so many small businesses, And actually, how we should select, the small businesses or small merchant that need to be supported. So actually, the data is very important because in the case of Indonesia, for small merchant or small business, they didn't pay the taxes. So actually, the data is very limited. So that's why it is in Indonesia, we have difficulty to select which small merchant, which businesses need to be supported since there are so many. If we want to support all, it really needs huge budget, but the selection is very difficult. So actually, we want to know, we want to learn from Korea how the Korean government select small merchant, small business that need to be supported, and also the support for the poor people, but not that work in the formal sector, because For the small formal sector, we have the data, but for the poor people that may not work in the formal sector, so it is very limited data. So I think that's my question. Thank you.
말씀드리겠습니다.
Yes, I would like to respond to your question. In the case of Korea, for the small businesses, if they are past a certain size, we do have some level of data, particularly the revenue and income levels, because the NTS, the National Tax Service, has access to tax receipt information, but there's also information that we can receive from elsewhere, such as our national health insurance or the pension service. So there are different kinds of revenue data that these different entities have, such as the health insurance and the pension service and the tax service. So we pooled data from these different government entities to identify and locate the different small businesses. In the early on, in the pandemic stage, this system was not established very early on. And so we try to provide support for every single citizen across Korea indiscriminately. However, recently, we've been more tailored in our approach to providing support to the small businesses to try to identify those particularly hardest hit sectors. This system of identifying the revenue and the income levels of the small businesses, I think, is going to be very important because in the future there might be other pandemics. So this kind of infrastructure, the system of having this data to understanding who are these small businesses would be very important. And as for freelancers, so one-person entrepreneurs, we can pull from National Pension Service and National Health Insurance Service data, but we also looked at other data sources as well. So if they are working in the military, or if they are working as outsourced personnel for the government, if they have been working for the government. So we have been pulling from various sources of data to try to understand the eligibility criteria of these freelancers. So I can say once again that we try to make use of different pieces of data, and this was helpful for us in identifying these people who needed support.
And we have a question from Mr. Agung. Mr. Agung.
Okay. Thank you for the excellent presentation. I would like to ask two questions. The first is about the fiscal capacity. I mean, in Indonesia case, the government had to increase the budget deficit significantly, especially in 2020 and 2021. So I see the presentation, the Korean enacted some of the supplementary budget. I would like to know, how did the Korea finance the supplementary budget? Is it by increasing the budget deficit or utilize other source of funding? If it is so, how to measure or limit those increase of the budget deficit? Because we have also to ensure the budget sustainability in the long term. The second question regarding the slide on the lesson learned slide, it is interesting to see the last point of the slide to find the right balance between disease control and economic recovery. I would like to the presenter to elaborate more on this issue because it is very important for us to learn how the government of Korea find this balance. I think this the question I would like to ask. Thank you.
재정에 대한 말씀을 간단히 드리면
To start with the question on our fiscal financing, well, inevitably in 2020 and 2021, we had no other choice but to issue more government debt, and therefore the fiscal deficit did increase. But fortunately, early this year, as the economic recovery started, we received excess tax revenue. So in 2022, the supplementary budget of this year was financed by the surplus tax revenue that we were able to collect this year. But in 2020 and 2021, it is true that our fiscal deficit increased. And going forward, the temporarily expanded spending will gradually be normalized in order for us to secure fiscal sustainability. And also for the balance, the question regarding the balance, shutting down the economy and maintaining disease prevention and control, how do we strike the right balance? Well, that is a very difficult question. I think the key here is without completely shutting down the economy, maintaining disease control and prevention, and this requires public cooperation by the people. I have resided overseas for a long time before recently returning to Korea, and the situation differs from country to country. Sometimes in some countries, the people are voluntarily just social distancing themselves and controlling and cooperating for disease control. Others do not. But I think the most important will be the people's cooperation. And in addition to that second question, striking the balance is very difficult to do between disease control and economy. And the Korean government also had a very tough time trying to find that balance. But in Korea, the top priority was given to the views of the experts. So whatever the experts had to say was heeded to, and so we strengthened control over the disease. But to the extent possible that we did not put too much harm to the economic activities, and we tried to recover the economy. So first, we listened to the experts' views, first on disease control, and secondly, also on the experts of the economy in order for us to maintain that balance.
Thank you. Do we have more questions from Indonesia? If you don't have any more questions.
Ask another question, please. One question. Okay. Thank you for the answer. I would like to respond about the tax revenue that increased in Korea. It means that the Korean government has already find the new fiscal resources needed for the revenue in the long term. So how the government Korea support this sector or these new resources so that it can sustainable in the longer term?
아직 한국 정부 재정 수지가 흑자로 돌아서
I cannot say that we are at a surplus level when it comes to the fiscal situation. However, while undergoing the pandemic, in the latter stages, the economy really expanded and recovered very quickly. So we were able to have immense tax receipts, a tax revenue. So we were not able to go into the black. However, beginning this year, we believe that we would be on track for certain levels of fiscal soundness. And this is something that I mentioned in my presentation, that beginning this year, we're going to work particularly on acquiring fiscal sustainability and having that included in the fiscal policies and the fiscal budget plan. If I were to also add as well, the fact that we have tax revenue, extra tax revenue this time around, so last year, fiscal year. Whether this is going to be an ongoing trend in the future, I cannot say. However, because the economy did better this year and did better last year compared to the year before, year on year, we were able to collect more taxes. But in the future, we don't know if this is going to be permanent because this did not entail extra measures on the part of the government. So we don't know exactly if this is going to continue as a trend.
Thank you. Do we have more questions here? If we don't have any more questions, then maybe we can wrap up the session. And if there's additional questions, you can always email us and we can hand over to Korea MOEF. Again, let's give a hand to Mr. Soohyun Yoon for his presentation today. And to give us our wrap up, let's have Mr. Oleksiy Balabushko, our B-CoP facilitator and lead governance specialist from the World Bank.
Thank you, Gina, and it's a pleasure to be here. First of all, I would like to thank all the presenters, participants, and organizers, the PEMNA Secretariat for an excellent event and actually ability to discuss Korea response to COVID-19, both in terms of policies but also implementation, which is really critical. It was very interesting to hear about the range of expenditure and revenue measures that Korea has put in place in response to pandemic. It kind of, I think, showed us through the discussion and through the presentations that fiscal policies and budget systems more generally need to be, from one point of view, robust and stable, but also allow to flexibly react to any shocks, which pandemic certainly was. It was also very interesting to see how important implementation is. I think we've heard on kind of several aspects of that, right? I mean, need to disburse quickly once the policies are set in place, impact on informality, and many others, which also show that the policy could be designed very well, but unless there are underlying systems that allow it to be effective, that really makes it less impact less than desirable. And I think it would be really interesting going forward, once most of those policies are done and evaluation is completed, to actually see the results of the evaluation and also see what worked better and what didn't work maybe as intended. But with that, let me thank everyone again for really great presentation and an excellent event, and look forward to many more like that. Thanks a lot, and I'll yield back to Gina. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Oleksiy, and that's it for today. We really appreciate everyone being here, and we would like to acknowledge again the presence of Mr. Kim Nam-oh, Mr. Rofianto Kurniawan, Mr. Soohyun Yoon, and Mr. Oleksiy. We would also like to thank everyone who joined today's meeting. And lastly, we will be sending out a post-event survey to the visiting countries, which is Indonesian participant. So please take a minute to complete the survey. And thank you all, and hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.